Hello and welcome back to the Metroball Grid. My name is Andre and thanks so much for tuning in. So just last Thursday, a new data pack came out and that's the final data pack of the Flashpoint Cycle. It's called Quorum and the first card in Quorum is called Sifr and it's this one we have on the screen. It's a console and it's a console that belongs to Null, an Anarch console, and it's actually generating a lot of discussion and a lot of interesting opinions. Generally the opinion overall is that this card is a bit busted. I think busted is a good word for it. And I want to make this video just to talk a bit about the card, what it can do, a bit about the design space of Netrunner and how I think this might change the meta, and also talk, which I think is really important, talk about some of the cards that can deal with this card particularly well, which could be useful because I'm assuming we're going to see this card a whole bunch. Just to give you an idea how much people care about this card specifically, this is the Netrunner subreddit on Reddit, and they do a thing called Card of the Day, where each day they'll talk about usually a new card that's come out, and this conversation alone, this might be the biggest card of the day. I think it might be. I don't have numbers to prove that, but this has over 100 comments and replies and people talking about the card and sharing their experiences and frustrations and all that. So 11 out of 10 fits the meta. So people really care about this card and it's making a big splash, and hopefully you'll understand very soon why that is. So just to start here, this is Sifr. It's Null's console. The word Sifr is it's the Arabic word for zero, which makes a lot of sense considering Null's theme about void, null, all that sort of stuff. And it is a console. So what do you have here? For 5 credits, you get this orange piece of hardware, and it gives you 2 MU off the bat, which is pretty great, and it has an ability. It's also unique. For what it's worth, most consoles are unique. You only have one installed. And the ability says, once per turn, when you encounter a piece of ice, you may reduce your maximum hand size by 1 until the beginning of your next turn. If you do, the strength of that ice is lowered to 0 for the remainder of the encounter. So there's the Sifr, the 0, and that's going to be the strength of the ice that you're encountering. So that's actually, I think that's a pretty absurd ability. It seems really good, and let's kind of just dissect this card to see what exactly it does. Just to start off, this is a console that gives you 2 MU, which is kind of rare for Anarch, right? I think Anarch do have a console that costs that gives them 2 MU. It's called Grimoire. It's from the core set. It costs 3 to install, which is a bit less and has a different ability. Compare that to something like Cyber Solutions Memchip, which I think is the only like vanilla 2 MU card in the game. It does cost 4 to install. The cost might be modified a bit by the fact that it's non-unique, whether that makes it cheaper or more expensive, that's kind of up to you to decide. But for 1 credit more, we're getting 2 MU, and 2 MU is something that's definitely valuable. Now, the next part of this card is its ability. And its ability says, once per turn, 1 piece of ice that you're encountering, strength is 0. And this is a really good effect, and for 2 main reasons. The first main reason is that generally, strength is one of the things that you have to worry about and pay money into when breaking ice. So for instance, okay, I guess we're not going to start here. Let's start with just Gordian Blade. Gordian Blade is a core set breaker, and the idea is that if you want to match the strength of a piece of ice, you have to pay 1 credit. So if you want to break a code gate that has strength 6, you have to pay 4 credits to start, and then start paying 1 per subroutine. If you're running Gordian Blade and then you're running Sifr, you can hit a code gate and you can make it 0 strength, which means that you can start breaking this piece of ice for just paying the subroutines, and you're saving a lot of money. If you're doing that once a turn just to break 1 big code gate with Gordian Blade, you might be saving 3 or 4 credits every turn, which is a whole lot of money. Like, that's just a lot of money. Specifically in Anarch, this is even more impactful, considering that you have cards like Yogg Point Not, and Yogg will break code gate subroutines for 0. Now, the condition about Yogg and all the other fixed strength breakers is that you can't really boost their strength without using other methods, and now with Sifr, you can take any code gate, irrelevant of its strength, and break it for 0 credits. You can only obviously do that once per turn, but the idea is if the corpse spends 6 credits resing a Fairchild, you can just kind of pull it apart for free, which is really good. But same goes for Mimic. Mimic idea is that you basically pay per subroutine, which against a strong big old sentry, that's a pretty big deal. Why does Sifr exist? I think largely because this sort of card. Null has 2 breakers, and I don't actually have a name for these breakers, but they're the breakers that gain strength if you use them to break. They also can't boost their strength, so the idea is if you're playing Nefr and you play Sifr, you can hit a barrier, reduce its strength for 0, so for sure you can break with Netrunner, and then eventually Netrunner will be really, really, really strong, and then you don't have to worry about that, and you have a really good barrier breaker. We also got Sunya, which is the killer version in Netrunner, but it's not very good, so I don't even think that's worth it. But that's the idea of Sifr. You save money breaking things. You save a lot of money, especially if you're playing Anarch, because you can play Yogg, and that's really, really good. There is a console that's generally considered the best console for criminal, and that is Desperado. So Desperado, in a turn, it can get you up to 4 credits if you're running every turn, maybe 5 in some cases, but let's say every turn it gets you 4 credits if you have perfect economy. Now, Desperado is on the most wanted list, which means if you want to include it in competitive play and you want to include it in your criminal deck, you're playing 1 influence for it. Now compare that to something like Sifr, which is also 1 influence, and I think the 1 influence on Sifr is one of the biggest reasons why it's kind of a mess. So if you swap out all your Desperados for Sifr and you're playing something like Yogg, or you're just playing normal breakers, if you make 1 run a turn and you reduce the cost, the strength on a sentry, usually up to like, if you reduce it on, not a sentry, any piece of ice, if you reduce it by at least 4 strength, generally you've saved 4 credits a turn, which means Sifr is probably better than Desperado. Sure, you've paid up more up front for this card, but you also got 1 extra MU than Desperado, which is really good for criminal. They can use their MU, and it seems like a better version of Desperado as long as you are breaking ice. And of course, you can build a rig that uses Yogg and Mimic and Femme Fatale, and you can basically make a thing that breaks ice really well and saves a lot of money doing it. So that's only the first way you can use Sifr, and the first way you can use Sifr is basically pick 1 piece of ice a turn and be able to break it for very little money, which is something we've seen before in a lot of other Netrunner cards. For instance, Security Nexus is a very similar idea. Security Nexus is a bunch more expensive, it's 8 credits to install, and once per turn you can choose a piece of ice and you can trace. And if the trace succeeds, you get past their ice and you bypass it, so you're not actually paying any extra money. If you don't have Link, or if the corp has more money than you, there's a chance you're going to have to pay extra to it. And also, this does give you a different benefit from Sifr, which is that if you hit a bad piece of ice and you don't have the breaker to deal with it, you can just take a tag and end the run. But let's compare that you have a breaker up with Sifr and you have Security Nexus. So for 3 influence and 8 cost, this is something that can bypass 1 piece of ice or deal with 1 piece of ice for relatively cheap every turn, as opposed to Sifr, which is 5 credits, 2 MU, and a single influence that's doing something very comparable, but a lot easier. All you need is basically a breaker, could just be Faust, and that's it. You don't need to win a trace, you don't need to do anything. You do have to do the hand size thing, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Other options that do that, we have Femme Fatale. Femme Fatale is very similar. Pay a lot of money, get a thing, put that on a piece of ice, and for the rest of the game, as long as that ice isn't trashed, Femme can bypass that piece of ice, generally paying 1 per subroutine, which is probably what you're going to be paying with your Sifr if you're using Mimic. If you're using Yogg, it's even cheaper, but the idea is you're paying 9 credits to be able to bypass regularly 1 piece of ice. You can't move your Femme unless you're playing something like Scavenge, but like the idea that if we want to play a card from hand that's just gonna like invalidate a single piece of ice in a turn, this costs 9. You do get a sentry at the end of the game, or like you do have a killer at the end of the day, which is pretty okay, but this is a lot harder to use than Sifr, and the idea is if you play Sifr, you can get that effect on any piece of ice on the board, and you can choose every turn which piece of ice that is whenever you hit it, which seems a lot stronger than Femme Fatale, and Femme Fatale is more expensive. I guess the last one I want to compare this to really quickly is Stimhack, and Stimhack seems to be very comparable considering it's only 1 influence as well. But the idea with Stimhack is you get 9 credits, and you can use the 9 credits to basically break any big old piece of ice for free, largely, as long as you have the appropriate breakers. And if you do, you take a permanent brain damage, which means your hand size decreases permanently, and whichever card you lose, you actually have to lose a card to the brain damage, is random. So compare that, right? Like, this card's easy to play, it's 1 event, you can recur it with same old thing, but compare that to Sifr, which once that's online, you kind of have mini stim hacks all day, which is kind of nuts. Now, being able to break ice really cheap is actually not the worst part. By worst, I mean technically best, but best part is Sifr. And the other part of Sifr is a card called Parasite. I'm going to leave Yogg up, that's probably useful. So Parasite is a core set Anarch program. It's a virus. When you put it on a piece of ice, it slowly gets virus counters and it decreases the strength of the ice. Eventually, when the ice hits 0 strength, it gets trashed. So the idea is if I put a Parasite on any piece of ice in the game, barring I think 3, and then I run into it with Sifr, I can reduce my hand size by 1 and Sifr will eat that ice. So regardless of data sucker counters, regardless of the strength of the ice, it can be the strongest ice in the game, which I think is strength 11, 10. Well, it really doesn't matter, I guess. Parasite eats all ice. Now, that doesn't seem that problematic considering yet the ice has to be rezzed, you have to put a Parasite on it, and then you have to run with Sifr, but the problems come up with instant speed tutoring. So cards like self-modifying code is probably the worst one to do this. Self-modifying, oh, there's probably a hyphen in here, right? So if you're playing against a Shaper deck, really? Modifying, I'm probably just bad at spelling. Yeah, that's because that's incorrect. So self-modifying code allows you to pay 2 credits to find any program from your stack and install it immediately. So if you're playing against a Shaper who's running Sifr, which I think is very easy to do considering it's only 1 MU, and you res a piece of ice, you say you res a really big, just a beefy piece of ice, you res your DNA tracker, you res your Chayashi, you res anything that you spent a lot of money on because you assumed it was going to be taxing for the rest of the game. The corporation, or sorry, the runner pays around 3 to 4 credits, puts a Parasite on that immediately while encountering, then also while encountering lowers its strength to 0 and immediately gets erased. And this is only one way that they can instant tutor Parasites. Obviously, if there's Parasites in the heap, at any point in time, anybody can clone chip a Parasite while using your Sifr and destroy any piece of ice that you do res now. Other ways is Anarch does have access to Street Peddler, which if they have a Parasite on their Street Peddler, they can instantly destroy any piece of ice they hit as well by pulling a Parasite off the Street Peddler. And those are really hard things to deal with. They're not impossible to deal with. There are ways to counter this sort of play, and we're going to get to that really soon. But the idea is that if you have Sifr on the table and you're playing against a Shaper that has an ability to tutor a card, you can't expect any of your ice to last longer than the encounter phase for which you paid money for the ice to exist, which is incredibly disheartening. Just really disheartening. Let's look at all the ice, right? So there's 170 ice currently in the game of Netrunner, and as of now, if my math is correct, I think there's only about 3 ice in the game which don't immediately fall to this Parasite Sifr thing, like to that combo. So the idea there's 167 ice in the game, which is largely irrelevant which ice you're playing in a lot of situations. It doesn't matter the strength, obviously. It doesn't matter the subroutines, the quality of the subroutines. It doesn't matter the on-encounter effects, because the runner will do their on-encounter effects first. It doesn't matter the type. 167, and that might be, the number actually might be a bit stronger, but let's say it's at least 150 pieces of ice, do not matter what they are. Which is, I really don't like that. Like that seems really, really rough. If they were just going to trash it immediately on access, on encounter, it's irrelevant what it is. And that seems to be a problem, not only because you don't have ice and that might not be fun to play a game of Netrunner, and that's like a different problem, whether or not it's fun to play the competitive Netrunner in the meta, that's like a whole totally different problem. But the idea is that 150, let's agree, cards in Netrunner, in the card pool that you have, are largely useless. I am being a bit, I forget what the word is. It's not a hyperbole, but I'm being a bit... When you run with Sifr, if you don't have a way to instant Parasite, the one thing about Sifr is that you're probably, and also if you don't have any sort of breakers, you are going to have to face check ice. So if you run into something and it's like a big bad sentry and you don't have a Mimic or an MK Ultra installed or in your heap, you're going to have to deal with it. So you're going to face check it. So the idea that all this ice is blank is not entirely true if the runner is allowing them to plant it into the ice. But if they do have self-modifying code into something like Clone Chip, that's a different story. It doesn't matter if you just paid all the money in the world to res a Giannis and like hurt them really, really, really bad, because it'll probably get deleted immediately. And I think that's a big problem in the game. This talk that I'm currently going on is not like, I would like to address not only the competitive side of Netrunner, but also the casual side of Netrunner. I know 100% the most exciting cards to me on the corp side when I was newer to Netrunner was always the ice. It's super, super exciting for a newer player to find like a cool piece of ice that they think is going to be absolutely disastrous when the runner's going to faceplant. And while that might be naive because people generally don't faceplant into ice that often, the fact that I can put a Shinobi in my deck and be totally jazzed that I can get a 1-turn kill, and then the runner just pulls out an SMC and Sifr and just like eats it up, seems like it's going to be that's not going to be good for new players. Like, it really isn't. It takes so much fun out of this entire design space, and that's, I would say, very frustrating that we have all these options that kind of end up to be the same. Let's talk a bit about this drawback here, right? Because once per turn when you counter a piece of ice, if you want to use Sifr's effect, you have to reduce your hand size by 1. And I'm not actually convinced that that is a proper drawback, if we want to call it that. So reduce your hand size by 1 is different than taking damage. It doesn't mean that you have to discard a card immediately. It means at the end of your turn, if you have more than whatever your hand size, if you have what your normal hand size is, you have to at least throw 1 card into the heap, which a lot of times actually can be good for Anarchs modernly. Like, they have all these breakers that come back from the heap, so the idea that I can use my Sifr and no, I don't have to overdraw to throw out my paperclip to get maximum efficiency, that actually might be good, which is pretty funny. Also, it just naturally counters things like Sweep Sweep, which is pretty funny, so I'm not convinced this is that bad. In terms of having 4 cards in hand, and that being an issue in terms of the safety of the runner, I guess it could be, just because Double Scorched gets slightly better. Yeah, it gets a bunch better unless they have I've Had Worse. There is 1 card in the card pool on the corpse size that says do 5 damage flat out. But otherwise, like, it's really hard to build a deck that capitalizes on those problems, and I'm just not convinced it is that big of a problem. Let alone, like, consider that this card read something similar to Stim Hack, which says if you want to do this, either throw out a random card or do an unpreventable brain damage or even just a net damage, how much different that would be. And I think that's a big deal. Yeah, so interestingly enough, Damon Stone, who's the lead designer of this game, appeared on a podcast called The Winning Agenda. The Winning Agenda is a podcast that talks about the competitive side of Netrunner, largely the tournament scene, stuff like that. Now, Damon Stone appeared on this before Sifr was released, and he was talking about the cycle, and he actually went on record to say that Null's console, which was yet to be revealed or released, was, when playtested within small groups, well, whatever the playtesting groups, everybody liked the card. They got along with it pretty well. And then right before the release of the card, whoever the other powers may be, Damon wished that he had more control to stop this. They decided to, and I quote Damon here, to sexify this Sifr card, and they sexified it up. So either they increased the ability, they decreased the costs, whether that be the play cost or the drawback, quote unquote drawback. And Damon says that he regrets that. And he thinks this card is, and I'm pretty sure I'm quoting Damon here, bonkers. He says the word bonkers, which is pretty great. And he even said the playtesters were assuming, they're begging Damon to say, when this card comes out, you have to put on the most wanted list the day it comes out. I might be incorrect, but I believe the current precedent set by the most wanted list is no card can get on the most wanted list until it's existed for 6 months, just so they can see how the meta reacts to it. And so that's going to be interesting. I think in errata, you can change the text on a card relatively quickly, but you can't actually, you can't most wanted list it. That's currently the precedent. I don't know who they're upholding to. Like, they could change that on they can change that whenever they want, I guess. And I think it's important to know that, like, Fantasy Flight Games has goofed this before. They have printed cards that have just been entirely overpowered, and they have apologized for it. And the one example I want to talk about right now was specifically the same incident. It's when there was a card that was coming out in testing. This specific card, nobody was, like, totally in love with. And right before they printed it, one of the people on the design team or what have you decided to make a change to it, and they didn't test it enough, and it turns out the card was, what I'm going to say, busted. This is Wireless Net Pavilion. Wireless Net Pavilion was you see I have this like diamond here. I don't know if that's like an edit or that's a Fantasy Flight release, but if you buy the card in a data pack, I'm pretty confident it doesn't come with this diamond, because it was errated to be unique after the card was released. And this card was released right before Worlds 2015. If you haven't seen why this card is super good, because originally when this card came out, people thought, oh, my resources are harder to be trashed. That doesn't seem that great. But Dan Dargenio, who is a 2-time world champion of Netrunner, brought a deck that involved Wireless Net Pavilion, Fall Guy, and Data Leak Reversal, which I'll pull up right here. This is Fall Guy. It further prevents assets from being trashed, and then Data Leak Reversal. So the idea was, with Data Leak Reversal on the table, if you were tagged, you could spend 4 to 5 clicks milling the top cards of your opponent's deck. They had to throw them out from their R&D, while you sat behind 3 Wireless Net Pavilions. And if you had the maximum rig out, 3 Wireless Net Pavilions, 3 Fall Guys, and some Data Leak Reversals, it cost the Corp 24 credits to begin to think of trashing your Data Leak Reversals, let alone the fact that they were under fire from account siphon, let alone the fact that the runner had Deja Vu to bring back Fall Guys. It was an absolutely absurd deck to deal with, and it won Worlds. I'm not trying to say to Dan Dargenio, like, he's obviously a really good player. I don't want to slight the skill required to pilot this deck, but the idea was that Fantasy Flight Games, a couple weeks after Worlds, said, we goofed. This card was meant to be unique. We changed it at the last minute. It's now unique. And even when it was unique, it almost won Worlds again this year, which is pretty great. Was that 2015 or 2016? That was 2016, right? 2015 was RP and all that. Okay, so 2016, just the year before. So the idea is that, like, you can goof and you can print a card that's too good. And this seems to be in a similar camp where they were changed, according to Damon, things were changed last minute and maybe not tested enough. And this card seems to be a bit absurd just because, let alone, okay, so it's super good for breaking stuff. It saves a lot of money every turn, and saving money every turn isn't the biggest deal. We have cards that give you good money in this pack, but the fact that it encourages 2 of the biggest cards in the design space that have been actively, 3 of the biggest cards in the design space that have been added to the most wanted list and, like, largely proclaimed to be a negative play experience or limiting the design space of cards. And those cards are Yogg, Parasite, and Clone Chip. Because all 3 together, like, this card is absolutely nuts. Sifr's nuts, and it just, again, it invalidates so much of the design space of the ice. I think this is important to understand, right? Because we have had good cards in this cycle. Like, things like Temujin Contract came out this cycle, and people looked at this card and thought, like, wow, this card's also busted. It has 20 credits on it, which is the most for any single card in the runner side. And you can run, you make 4 credits a run, and make other unsuccessful effects, access cards, do all that nice stuff. But I'm not going to argue that, like, maybe Temujin has a bit too little influence on it. That's a different problem. But the idea is Temujin doesn't do anything. Like, it does have an impact on the meta. People are playing less naked remotes. People are icing up archives. And, like, it does change the game. But it doesn't allow runners to do anything that they couldn't do entirely before, besides have more money. Compared to the Sifr, which just says any piece of ice I can trash trivially. Which is just such a bigger deal. So that's exactly what Sifr can do, and whether or not it's going to be a problem, whether the, like, at a competitive level everyone's going to be playing Sifr, and if you're not, you're just not playing the best deck, that's yet to be determined. There was one store championship around my parts on Saturday, and I know the winning deck list was a Valencia deck list that was running Sifr, Clone Chip, Parasite, Yogg, all that fun stuff, and from the Heat Breakers I think are really important too. So it's definitely good and competitively viable. Whether it's going to homogenize the playfield, we'll see. If I haven't made it obvious, I'm actually most scared of Shaper with Sifr, just because Shaper can run that self-modifying code. They can run the Clone Chip, the Scavenge, and get those parasites out all the time. They can also run Atman at 0, which is super good with Sifr, just because Atman at 0 can now break any piece of ice largely. That's at 0 strength, what Sifr can do. And this deck actually looks to be much more annoying to deal with. So how do we deal with Sifr? That's the next big question, right? And there's a bunch of, like, just different ways I think you can play the game, and different unique, like, counter cards, what we want to call them. Not exactly silver bullets, but cards that make Sifr not so good, that I'm just going to run through really quick. I might forget some. I have a list here on my right, so I'm going to try and get through everything I wrote down real quick, but let's just talk about what we can do about it. The one big counter to Sifr that I am least excited for, which I fear that the meta might switch to, is just run less ice. And generally decks that run less ice run more assets. And I'm not saying asset spam is like the worst thing. You just need to have a deck that deals with it. And I know it also rubs a lot of players the wrong way, casual players maybe, but even a lot of competitive players. They just don't like the idea that Netrunner is so much different than what was originally advertised to them, which is breakers, ice, access on central servers. And again, that's another thing about Sifr, which if Sifr changes the game, it might not 100% be for the worst. You have to understand, of course, it is a living card game and things are bound to change. Whether or not it changes in a way you like is a personal question, and I'm not actually excited for the way that Sifr changes the game. Now, yeah, just like I said, one of the counters to having ice that falls apart is just running more assets and basically putting the attention of the runner less onto breaking ice for really cheap or destroying it and more onto dealing with your asset spam. So things like Industrial Genomics, if you haven't seen deck lists, Gagarin, all these sort of decks that don't actually care that much about their ice per se, might see a lot more play. These decks are being constantly countered by Wizard with other sort of things like Salt Set Slums and other like hot tech cards. So it's kind of going to be a battle whether or not they can keep up. Friends in High Places helps a lot too. Let's go through faction. Let's just go through faction. We'll start with HB because I think HB has the most amount of cards that can deal with Sifr really well. I think Architect is really good. It costs influence, but it's an ice that can be trashed, and it's always going to be relevant. It's either, if it fires, it's obviously really bad, but it either is going to be 2 credits with Mimic, or it's always going to be, I think, 3 credits with MK Ultra, and for that reason, it's pretty good. It's hard to splash this card. It's 3 influence outside, 1 influence in HB, but this card's seeming really good. Other cards in HB are similar things that are pretty difficult to be trashed. I spelled that entirely incorrectly, but this is Magnet, which can fall to Yogg, but the idea is that this is a piece of ice that cannot be parasited, which is pretty good and basically demands the runner to find their Yogg or to find their Code Gate Breaker if they were doing the SMC parasite thing, and that is definitely worth something. Sadly, the ability to res Magnet and pull a parasite off of another piece of ice is likely going to happen less and less, considering I think most of the parasites are going to be instant parasites and they're not going to be hanging around, which is kind of a bummer. But yeah, Magnet's okay. It's 1 influence, so it's actually pretty easy to splash. I think Labdog is cool. Whether or not it's good enough, it depends. It's a trap that trashes an installed piece of hardware. The runner chooses the hardware, so if they're running 2 pieces of hardware, say a clone chip and a Sifr, or a Sifr and anything, they'll probably let the Sifr stay and trash the other thing. Labdog is also 0 strength and has no type, so if a runner has things like Faust, they can break it. If they're running things like Atman 0, they can also deal with it. So it might not always fire, but it's definitely going to be annoying, and it might trash the Sifr every once in a while. I think a really important one too, considering Labdog trashes itself, is you might want to consider Friends in High Places. If your ice is getting constantly trashed, some of the best things that you can do is just keep bringing that ice back. Friends in High Places, for 1 click, you can bring back 2 ice, which is probably better economy than the runner's going to get out of parasiting things. So that's actually pretty great. Helion beta test recently came out. I've never seen this card played, but in theory, this is one of the only cards that can unconditionally trash installed runner cards, so you can get rid of a Sifr. What else we got? We got Ronald 5. It's pretty underwhelming, but Ronald 5 makes trashing cards with Parasite makes you lose a click. I'm not convinced this card is that good, considering if the runner is trashing cards, they're running anyways, so you can probably just run enhanced login protocols, which will make the whole Sifr thing just way more taxing. Wait, is there a hyphen in it? Do all these cards have hyphens in it? I don't know. Login protocols. Oh man, I'm downing my spelling now like all the time. Enhanced login protocol, singular. Okay, so this one helps a lot too. It just makes running a bit harder, which if they're going to be trashing with Sifr, they need to run every turn. Or if they want to get value with Sifr, they're going to be running every turn. I think the last one, which probably is the strongest, is Arc Lockdown. And I don't like Arc Lockdown, and I'm probably going to go digress on another point at this time, but Arc Lockdown is like a really strong counter card. So if you're playing against a Shaper that's recurring like a single Parasite over and over again with Clone Chip, you can basically Arc Lockdown their Parasite. If the runner is playing Anarch and is throwing out their MK Ultras and their Black Orchestras, and they're expecting like, oh, once the runner reses a big code gate and I have to deal with it, I'll pull my breaker from the heap. You can remove that from the game too, and that's also very strong. I think this is the easiest counter card, especially to the Shaper one, which I'm more scared of. It's 2 influence, which is kind of hard to splash. In Weyland, you can tutor it. In HB, you can run more than one of it, and it's it's like generally a good card regardless of the matchup, so this is actually worth something. Yeah, I guess I sorry to digress backwards, but I just want to talk a bit about the design of Sifr again. And that's because this is such a hard counter to so many cards in the card pool, and there's very little counterplay. Like, we've gone through, I think, everything in HB that deals with it, and I think HB has the most cards to deal with Sifr particularly. So not only there's a chance that it'll homogenize the competitive play space, which is not very good. Like, it's currently, for the last 2 months or so, at the competitive level of Netrunner, the top tables, they've been largely diverse in terms of all factions being represented, different IDs, things like that. Sure, there's been a lot of wizard. I think controlling the message isn't as good as it used to be, but like everybody was up there. There's Blue Suns winning store championships. Andy just got back again, and it's been really good. But the idea is if you need your magnets and you need your architects just to deal with Sifr, there's basically only one faction you can probably play, and that's HB. And HB generally only has, I think, 2 IDs that get competitive play, which is a separate problem. But like if the top tables are just that homogenized, it's probably not great for the game. Now, one thing I want to talk about Arc Lockdown and Sifr is that they basically they invalidate so many cards without any sort of counter strategy, like very little strategy. And this reminds me so much of a card I actually detest. And I know a lot of people like this card a lot. And that's Rumor Mill. Rumor Mill is a current, and it just says it says unique cards besides regions are blank. So the idea was there's a lot of defensive upgrades in this game that used to be very, very, very good. Things like Caprice Nisei. Caprice was the best defensive upgrade in the game. You put a bunch of ice in front of a Caprice, and it's actually really taxing to even get an attempt to play a side game and to get into a server. That was a very easy way for a lot of decks, a lot of corporations to score their agendas. Again, Dan D'Argenio, 2015 world champion. This was a big card. Now compare Rumor Mill, which the idea about Rumor Mill's existence alone affects what people bring to the table. Because Rumor Mill exists, people aren't playing Caprice and decks anymore. People are not playing a lot of Polana. People are not playing a lot of Jinteki in general. People aren't playing Ash, maybe for arguably different problems. But there's just a lot of cards that people have in their binders or their boxes that they're just not bringing to the table, because there's a large chance that the card that they bring will either not work or just be a liability in their deck. And that's pretty bad, considering the amount of play required to play Rumor Mill is very, very low. You just put in your deck, you play 1 credit. You don't even have to play it until like the corp installs, advances an agenda, and now you know you need it. I also think runner currents are stronger than corp currents, considering runner recursion is a lot better. So there's a lot of problems. And before Rumor Mill came out, the only thing that we had to deal with these currents were cards like Political Operative and Councilman. And this card's interesting because it actually has a lot of like high skill cap play. It has conditions. It has a lot of instant effects where you can choose when to use it. Should I use it on the Jackson, or am I worried there's going to be an Ash coming up? And we even have cards like Interdiction that recently came up, which I know how to spell. And this one is like similar, where it's just generally worse than Rumor Mill, so it doesn't get play. But this is one of those interesting cards that would impact how people play defensive upgrades as opposed to not playing them at all. Arc Lockdown's kind of similar, but you can play around it a bit. But that's the same thing with this ice. It's just so much of this ice you can't play, or you don't want to bring to the table, because there's a chance my Curtain Wall and my Blue Sun deck, rip that Blue Sun deck, it's just a liability, and you're never going to res it because you'll lose 14 credits. Anyways, sorry to digress there. I just wanted to mention Rumor Mill because that card is similar to this. Let's jump to Weyland, right? Because we've been talking about the Blue Sun thing. Taurus is cool. Taurus is a neato card that people are not respecting. If they faceplant into this, and a lot of Anarchs will faceplant against some Weyland Ice, considering most of it is generally barriers. And this one says Trace 2. Regardless of whether or not they break the trace, if you at least put 3 credits into this trace, you can trash a piece of hardware. It's your choice. Get rid of that Sifr. And that seems pretty good. If they want to break this, I don't think if they're running Sifr Parasite Anarchs, I don't think they're running David, so this is harder to deal with. They could always Sifr it and pull out their MK Ultra, and that's a different problem, but this is something. You also have Power Grid Overload, which is just largely not a good card, but technically this will get rid of hardware. And you have Chief Slee, and Chief Slee is actually kind of exciting. I wish this card was slightly better, but this is the card in Weyland that says do 5 meat damage, which is, I think, the only damage card that can like directly benefit off of the runner having 4 cards in hand. So the idea is that you, the runner, it does a couple cool things, right? If the runner's going to run into a piece of ice and you res like a hive or something or a curtain wall, and they're not going to break it because they were like, okay, well now I'm just going to end the run, install my parasite on it, run again, and trash it with Sifr. From what I understand, you don't get the counters from when the ice gets trashed by parasite, but you'll get free counters from them face checking and bouncing off things, or face checking and just flying through things that they will break later on in the game or what have you. It's like, oh, I hit a Veritas, I'll break it, I'll trash it later. For now, I'll just go through it because I'm going to face check a bunch. And this card, if you do get 5 counters on it and they have 4 hand size, you spend 1 click and they die. And for that reason, this card's actually kind of interesting and might actually slow down. It basically requires, if they can't contest the remote Chief is in, it requires them to have their breakers, because if they're face planting ice with no way to deal with it, this is going to get counters really fast. And that's going to be a problem. Meat damage in general. If you have no hand size, or you have 4 hand size, and you're only running 1 I've had worse in your hand, double Scorched Earth works. Also, Boom is generally always good. Builder Nations also might be considered. Actually, no, right? Because if they trash the ice, I don't think they take the meat damage. This seems less good. In Jinteki, Jinteki can serve up some hot death. And Jinteki's really good at killing the runner. This is Ronin. I think one of the big ways to deal with Sifr is obviously not rely on ice that much. So if you're playing something like Potential Unleashed, Personal Evolution, Industrial Genomics, all those IDs don't depend on ice that much, considering they just run spiky traps. And the idea is that if you have a Ronin on the table, this can do 3 net damage. So you have to reduce their hand size a bit more. So you can run something like Chairman Hero. You res Chairman Hero after they've used their Sifr, and now they have hand size, 2? And you can just blow them up with an early MPs or Ronins, and all that stuff is actually really good. Marcus Batty is also, oh, I forgot one, right? Marcus Batty is also pretty good. You can, on the approach, I believe, fire Marcus Batty on a resed piece of ice, and maybe fire like a really dirty subroutine, like a trash programs or trash a hardware, and that could be really good. Jumping back to Sifr, we have Corporate Troubleshooter. And this is only good if the ice isn't getting parasited, but if, like, say the runner is running on a Fairchild 3 on their second click, and they're assuming that they're going to Sifr the ice and then break with Yogg. So you let them Sifr it at strength 0, and then you use your Corporate Troubleshooter to boost it up to, like, strength 4. And if they don't have Data Suckers, it's going to fire, and that's going to be pretty glorious. You can also bring this back with Friends in High Places, which is really good. This is the point where I should have mentioned earlier that something really important to deal with Sifr, the reduction overrides all other increases to strength. So if you're running things like IT Department or Sandburg as depicted here, and the strength of the ice is like now 8, it's an Enigma plus 6, and they reduce it to Sifr, it doesn't go to 0 plus Sandburg, it just goes straight to 0. I think this is an interesting ruling, and to me it doesn't line up with previous rulings of a similar idea. Cards like Echo Mind, the idea is your memory limit is equal to the cards in your grip. So if you have no cards in your grip, your memory is 0. But if you have something on your table like an Akamatsu Mem chip, your memory is now 1. So this thing doesn't overrule different modifiers, like this fires first and then modifiers, as opposed to, whatever that we just pulled up. I clicked on a different thing, right? Whatever. As opposed to IT Department or Sandburg, which they happen before. Maybe it's a constant, I don't know. And then like the ice is always going to be 0. The only way around it is Corporate Troubleshooter, and that's only so good, right? You also got Hostile Infrastructure, which seems like a big deal. If they are going to instant parasite your, man, why do I have to spell things? If they're going to instant parasite your ice, they're going to be trashing a card, and they're going to take net damage, which they have reduced hand size plus net damage. So now accessing Ronin, all this other stuff actually seems pretty potent. Against NBN, I don't think you have a lot of options. I think Archangel's very good just because it fires on axis. So in theory, if they run R&D, you can fire an Archangel and they won't have time to instant parasite it because they're accessing it and not encountering it. Or they encounter it, right? But you can't install Parasite on it because it's not installed. And so you can potentially get a Trace 6 off and bounce their Sifr, which is pretty annoying. You also just have Controlling the Message, which punishes runners for trashing cards. So if they want to trash your ice with an instant Sifr, whatever, take a tag. That's good. Neutral, you have some options. Best defense, if they're running a bunch of tags, not very likely. You can best defense away their console. Shatter Remains seems pretty sweet. Shatter Remains. If you advance this, it's an advanceable trap. They access it, you can trust their Sifr. You can even use things to move counters onto this before they access it. Things like AstroScript Pilot Program or even Mumbad Construction Company if you really want this thing to fire. And this is like a pretty good way, I guess, if they're running on advanceable things. And then lastly, you have Curfew, which will continue to reduce their hand size, the runner's hand size, to a point where it actually might be annoying or potentially lethal. Right? Like you do a bunch of brain damage. You hit Enforced Curfew. Mushin no Shin's also very good, if I haven't mentioned that already, just because you can run traps, and traps don't require ice, and that's really good. I think that's the majority of cards that deal with it. Oh, I obviously forgot like a really, really big one. That's Lotus Field. Lotus Field can have its strength reduced. So can't Yogg it really unless you have Net Ready Eyes or that other card that boosts the strength of a Icebreaker from the core set, forget the name. Or you have Black Orchestra, which breaks us for 3, which isn't that bad all things considered. But this one is pretty good because it just can't be ciphered at all. And that's a big deal. It's also 1 influence, so it's like a really big deal because it's very, very, very splashable. Woof. Okay, that's all the cards, I think, that deal with Sifr in some reasonable way. There's a big chance that I forgot one or other. I think the big ones you want to focus on are Best Defense, Arc Lockdown, Lotus Field, Magnet, Architect. I think that's largely it, if you want to actually play while using ice behind servers. We're going to see what this card does to the meta. I'm not excited. I think it's kind of bad design just because it invalidates so much of the ice. I've said this over and over again, I guess. It invalidates so much of the ice with very little counterplay. The counterplay to this card is very specific, and if you just look at the color pie that I kind of given you, or like the distribution, it's mostly HB cards. So I don't know if you want to just play HB against Sifr for a really long time, or maybe the like, I don't know, maybe it'll turn out differently. I'm not actually that pessimistic, because I think eventually this card is going to hit the most wanted list, or like some errata or some changes come to it, because the agreement generally is that this card is too good for its cost, let alone its downfall, let alone the influence. And the influence is the biggest part, because this is so easy to use in every faction, and every faction can use it in a way that's just absolutely absurdly good than anything else they have in their hardware slot. Arguably, the biggest downside of Sifr is that it takes up the console, so that an Anarch can't be running Grimoire or Turntable or Obelisk, which are all also very, very, very good cards. That's probably the biggest downside of this card. Is there anything cool else about you can do with Sifr? I guess there is. If you don't want to do like hyper competitive, abusive sort of stuff, you can run things like Worm and Darwin and actually use them as breakers, which is pretty hilarious. I dig that. You can also play this in Geist, right? And get your cloud breakers up faster, and that actually might be fun. That's this card. I probably talked for a really long time, and I hope you learned something about this card particularly. I have no doubt this card is going to be addressed by FFG in the near future due to just sort of the impact it has been causing. I'm excited to see what's happening in the near future. I have seen deck lists coming in, like just this Saturday, the Store Championship in Ottawa was won by a Sifr deck, and I think we're going to see a lot of this coming up from all around the world, and we're going to be interesting to see how the meta is going to be building around it. That's an important thing, right? This is a living card game, and so the meta is not always going to be the way that you like it. The Blue Sun deck that I've been playing for the last like 6-7 months in Store Championships and doing really well with it is largely invalidated by this single card, which on one side is a total bummer, but on the other side, I guess I'll have to learn something different. So you just gotta figure it out. As Damon said in his interview, is he hopes that the meta is going to be able to adapt to this card because he knows it's going to have to. So it's really important you understand how to do that. And I guess that's what half of this piece is for. The other part was just a diatribe, right? Thanks so much for watching. We'll have the corp side of this data pack coming up real soon. It has some really great cards in it too. Cards that help against this one? Not entirely. Somewhat. I think Macrophage is pretty great, but we'll get to that soon, right? Thanks for watching. Ciao.